BBC.
BBC. You're with the BBC. And you're listening to the BBC World Service from London. There'll be a full World News Bulletin for you in just under half an hour. But now, this week's edition of Reporting Religion with Damon.
This is the BBC World Service.
The latest international headlines. The death toll from the Asian tsunami keeps rising. It's now 120,000. Relief aid is arriving but hampered by...
In this edition, large parts of Burma have been devastated by a cyclone. The authorities say at least 350 people have been killed, with the main city, Rangoon, one of the area's worst hit.
The Soviet government reports an accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the Ukraine, resulting in damage.
The region affected by China's worst earthquake in 30 years is vast, over 1,000 kilometers across and taking in 3 provinces.
Out over the city, and where there was dry land, there is now several feet of water, and the water will rise.
Katrina, now the worst natural disaster in American history.
We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. Flight director confirms that. We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point.
When bad things happen, who is to blame? Disasters are often described as acts of God, but is that just an excuse to let mankind off the hook? Often, when people know bad things are likely to happen, like the flooding of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, they don't do enough to avoid the consequences. So can an individual take a stand to avoid tragedy, or does society prevent them from speaking up? Marc Gerstein's new book is called Flirting with Disaster. He says there's a bystander effect when people decide not to speak out, even when they know trouble is coming. And Philip Zimbardo is Professor of Psychology at Stanford University in the United States and author of The Lucifer Effect, Understanding How Good People Turn Evil. I asked Mark first where he thinks we should be pointing the finger of blame.
Organizations do conspire to make it very hard for people to do the right thing, even when they bring issues up. There's an enormous amount of pressure that gets brought to bear on people not to be difficult. In the case of the Columbia Space Shuttle example, the illustration that I provide is by a single engineer whose job it was to look after risk from the foam that eventually destroyed the spacecraft. And he basically ran up against bosses that said that they didn't want to be Chicken Little, and they did not want to escalate a claim that they thought would probably come out to be essentially no big deal. And even this individual engineer, who was quite energetic, at some point gave up and allowed the meeting to go on, in which he probably could have turned the tide. Those things happen all the time.
Philip Zimbardo.
Yeah, it's very difficult to be a whistleblower against a powerful system, whether that system is a corporation or political party, because the system has the power to degrade you, to say you're a troublemaker, you're a dissident, you're a radical, you're, stupid, incompetent. So most whistleblowers, to be effective, really have to form a unit, really have to get a number of other people to agree with them before they go public. Otherwise, they're almost always ignored. The system has ways to crush them, especially in some emergency situation where someone wants the shuttle to fly at a particular time, or generals in a battle that they know if they can take this hill, they will get another star. They don't want to listen to reason, and they underestimate the real risks involved.
Mark, you think that many of them are avoidable, preventable. Could you give some examples of what's gone wrong and how humans might have avoided that?
Well, my favorite disaster is probably Hurricane Katrina, which was the best predicted American disaster in recent history. And it was obvious to people at almost every level of government and private enterprise that New Orleans would flood if it was hit by a large storm. As a matter of fact, the FEMA, the Environmental Protection arm of the U.S. federal government, had done a preparatory analysis and had predicted that it would be catastrophic. And yet, when the storm came, they weren't ready.
So why then, in your view, did people stand by?
Well, I think there are several reasons. That people always deny risk even when it's put right in front of them. And people believe that they had more time than, in fact, they had. And another reason in that particular case was that the various levels of government couldn't agree about who was going to pay for it. And so there was endless bickering over money, and naturally the time ran out before the money arrived.
So, Philip Zimbardo, you might say that that wasn't simply incompetence, it was in some way the influence of evil, would you?
Well, I guess my take on it is that when I focus on evil, I focus on three things. There are perpetrators, individuals, who we have to understand. There's a specific situation which they operate. But the third level is the level of the system that creates the bad barrel, that corrupts good apples. And I think what happened at Katrina is a system failure, that there were politics involved. The mayor and governor of New Orleans and Louisiana were different political parties. There was multiple levels of National Guard and Army Reserve and all of these things in conflict and local police. And so there was no way to organize these systems which were in conflict rather than in unity. So literally everything fell apart at the center.
So, Philip Zimbardo, and was that because people didn't care or they cared only for their own survival? You've carried out experiments which suggest that people really don't have that sense of shared humanity.
Well, it's very easy for people to get trapped in a situation where they lose their usual sense of compassion for others, the usual sense of rationality, and they begin to focus too narrowly on minute issues which essentially are irrelevant for the overall survival of in that particular setting.
Tell us about the experiment that you carried out, which does put people together in a situation where they could be helpful, but they weren't.
Yeah, many years ago I did an experiment called the Stanford Prison Experiment, where we put good people in a bad place. Good people being college students from all over the United States, who we chose because they were as normal and healthy as we could find based on a series of personality tests. We put them in a mock prison, which was designed to be as realistic as most prisons are. And the idea simply was, the good people dominate a bad situation, or do bad situations dominate good people? And the sad news for humanity is that the majority of people get corrupted in bad or evil-generating situations. Guards begin to behave brutally, sadistically. Prisoners begin to have emotional breakdowns. And the experiment was supposed to go for 2 weeks. I was forced to terminate it after 6 days because it was out of control. I no longer felt, I as the principal investigator and I as the prison superintendent, felt that I could control the guards, could limit the abuses they were heaping on the prisoners.
Well, we painted a fairly negative and pessimistic picture here, but there are some who do speak out. There was, for example, in the case of Abu Ghraib, the prison shame that affected so many people back in 2004, that was in the end revealed by an individual. What marks out those heroes, Philip Zimbardo?
Well, that's really a very interesting question, and it's the main one that I'm working on for the rest of my life, something I call the Heroic Imagination Project. But in the case of Joe Darby, he was the Army reservist who exposed the Abu Ghraib abuses. And interestingly, at first he was what's called a leaker. He deposited the CD with all those horrendous pictures in the mailbox of a senior investigating officer. And then he realized they could just take it and throw it away. So the next day he became a whistleblower. That is, he went and said, I was the one who did it, and it stopped the abuses. Now, what's interesting is we want to believe that people who engage in those kinds of heroic deeds, and for me a hero is very simply an ordinary person who takes extraordinary action on behalf of others, knowing that there could be a personal cost. We know almost nothing about the psychological makeup of those people. Almost all the research done on heroes has been interviews done years after the heroic act. So we don't know anything about that heroic, decisive moment, the moment when the individual is going through this mental calculus of the costs and benefits of taking this action. And that's the kind of research that is needed, but is really missing, certainly in psychology.
Marc Gerstein, what's supposed to help people in those situations where they should be speaking out is a moral framework, which, for many around the world, is their faith. Is there a way in which conscience and faith can be linked to getting the system right, to making the systemic failures that you described harder for humanity to contemplate?
I think people's faith is very important, as are their values. But we put people in an enormously difficult position. As Philip was saying, when people try and talk out of turn as the system would define it, they are crushed by that system. They're punished ruthlessly. They lose their jobs. They are threatened in all sorts of ways. In the recent Federal Aviation Administration crisis in the U.S., where aircraft weren't being inspected, the individuals who were essentially bringing this matter to the public's attention were threatened directly, not only to lose an individual job, but one man was threatened to have his job and his wife's job destroyed as a result of his going public. I think we have to make organizations more benign in the sense that when people wish to speak up, they can do so without fear of reprisal. And that means that the people who would make the truth tellers silent, who would wish that they would go back and behave themselves, they need to be the ones that are punished. Unfortunately, that is a politically very, very difficult thing to do.
Marc Gerstein and Philip Zimbardo. So what do you think? Do you believe that evil flourishes when good men do nothing? Have you ever been a whistleblower? Or have you been made helpless by a system which stopped you doing the right thing? Now, we always like to hear your views on the items we cover, and also on the items you think we should cover. Ebenezer Aponsa from Ashaiman in Ghana emailed reportingreligion@bbc.co.uk, and he said, "For me, your programme is one of the best on the BBC World Service, but in my view, you concentrate a lot on Islam, and I'd like to know more about other religions that you've not yet discussed. Keep on with your good work." Well, thanks for that, Ebenezer. We'd like to hear from you then. Are there items, are there faiths that you think we should be covering, but we're not? Get in touch. Reporting Religion, it's all one word, at bbc.co.uk. Reporting Religion at bbc.co.uk. And I look forward to reading your ideas.
If you do have the internet, then do visit the BBC World Service website. You can listen to the programme again and access a whole archive of documentaries and features, as well as the latest news, updated every minute. It's all there at bbcworldservice.com.